They thought I did not hear, but I did. I heard every syllable, each one landing like a pebble thrown against glass, until the pain trembles with the certainty it will soon crack. "She can't pay anyway," my grandson said, his voice not low enough to spare me, not high enough to announce it as a joke, but pitched exactly in that cruel middle ground where you can claim innocence after the damage is done. It was at the pharmacy counter, under the bright, indifferent lights that flatten every face into something tired and a little sickly. I had walked there myself, with care, with effort, because the bus leaves me a block away and the pavement is uneven. My shoes are worn in the places that speak of years rather than miles. I had the prescription in my hand, the one I need more than bread or tea, the one my doctor insists is not optional, not negotiable, and still he said it, loud enough for the cashier and the woman behind us, with a cart of diapers and chewing gum, to glance at me, then quickly away. They glance the way strangers do when they witness a small humiliation that costs them nothing, a moment they will forget by the time they carry their bags to the car. But for me it was a moment that froze into something sharp, something permanent, because it was my own grandson who said it, the boy I once carried on my hip, while I stirred a pot with the other hand, the boy I sang to in the small hours when his mother could not keep her eyes open. That boy has grown into a man who looks at me not with tenderness, but with calculation, who sees in me not the woman who once held his entire world together, but a liability, a number on a receipt, a shadow at a counter, a debt waiting to happen. I am 78 years old. I live alone now, in a narrow apartment that smells faintly of dust and lavender polish no matter how often I clean. It is not misery, it is not wealth. It is a room where I can hear myself think, where the kettle whistles just for me, where the curtains fall the way I arrange them and not the way someone else insists. But it is also a place of silence, where footsteps echo too loudly, and where sometimes I find myself speaking out loud just to prove that my voice has not abandoned me the way so many people have. My husband has been gone for more than a decade, his laugh folded into memory like a pressed flower that still gives off scent when opened. My children are scattered, busy, always moving with the speed of lives that seem allergic to pause. They love me, I tell myself, though their love is often disguised as postponements, as polite excuses, as birthday calls placed while stirring a pot or driving to soccer practice. And my grandson, the one who once called me his second mother, because I was the only one patient enough to listen to his long stories about school, about the dragon he imagined under his bed, about the way his teacher favored another boy. He has become the person who looks at me in line at a pharmacy and declares to the world that I cannot pay. What hurts is not the lack of trust in my wallet, but the assumption about my worth. Money has always been invisible to me in the way air is invisible. It is there or it is not, but you keep breathing regardless. I worked, I saved, I tucked bills into envelopes when others flaunted theirs at department stores. I was never rich, but I was steady. My grandson never knew the hours I spent behind a desk, the nights I came home with my back burning from the long bus ride, the coins I dropped into a jar labeled college, even when it meant rice instead of meat on the table. He never knew because I never told him. Why would I burden a child with the arithmetic of sacrifice? I wanted him to feel free, light, unencumbered, believing the world would open simply because he reached for it. But freedom without memory breeds arrogance. And so here we are, me standing at the counter, him declaring me penniless, the past erased as neatly as chalk washed from a blackboard. The lights above hummed. The cashier, a young woman with nails painted the color of cherries, froze for a moment, her eyes flickering between us, unsure whether to offer pity or proceed with the mechanical smile drilled into her training. My grandson held his card in his hand, tilting it toward her with a flourish as if to save the day. It was not generosity. It was performance. It was the kind of gesture that announces itself. Look at me, the good grandson, rescuing the frail old woman who cannot manage her own life. He would probably tell the story later to his mother, to his friends, perhaps even to strangers, as proof of his virtue. And I stood there, with my prescription, with my dignity clamped tight between my teeth, and I realized that the world had shifted when I was not looking. I was no longer Martha, the woman who once knew how to stretch a meal for 6 from a single chicken, who balanced checkbooks with precision, who kept every utility paid on time and never asked for a dime she did not return. I had become Grandma who cannot pay. That was the new story. And in stories, once the first line is spoken, it echoes until someone dares to rewrite it. I walked home slowly after that day, the little white bag of medicine pressed against my side like contraband. My grandson walked ahead, phone in hand, already elsewhere. He did not notice the way I stopped at the corner to catch my breath, the way I shifted the bag from one hand to another as though it were heavier than it was. He did not look back. Why would he? He had already done his part. I followed behind, counting the cracks in the pavement, remembering the days when he could not take 3 steps without looking over his shoulder to see if I was there, when my presence was his anchor. Now it seemed my presence was an inconvenience, a reminder of something he wished invisible. At home I placed the medicine on the table, boiled water for tea, and sat in my chair by the window. The city moved outside with its usual rhythm, people carrying groceries, children dragging backpacks, buses sighing at the stop. I thought about the sentence, "She can't pay anyway," and realized it was not just a careless remark. It was a verdict. It was a stripping of identity. It was a declaration that I no longer controlled the narrative of my own life. And for the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt something stir in me that was not resignation, not quiet acceptance, but a kind of anger that burned low and steady, like a candle that refuses to go out. It whispered to me that I was not finished, that I was not yet the caricature he wanted to paint, and somewhere in the back of a drawer, behind scarves folded and refolded too many times, lay the object I had almost forgotten, the one my husband insisted I keep untouched. A card, black as midnight, heavier than it should be, embossed with letters that had always frightened me with their authority. He had placed it in my hand years ago and said, "For emergencies only. For when you need to remember who you are, I have not touched it in more than 10 years. But that night, after my grandson's careless betrayal, I opened the drawer and traced the edges of the envelope that contained it. My hands trembled, not from weakness but from recognition. Perhaps this, I thought, was the emergency. Not the absence of money, but the absence of respect. Not the lack of means, but the lack of memory. The next time it happened, there was no way to pretend it was accidental, no way to soften it with excuses about nerves or misunderstanding, because humiliation, once spoken aloud, becomes easier to repeat, as if the first time opened a door that will not close again, and so a week after the pharmacy incident we returned to the same place, the same bright counter, the same indifferent lighting, and I carried another prescription that had to be filled, my grandson at my side scrolling through, his phone, and I could already feel the tension in my chest, as if the words were waiting for him like old companions eager to be released. I handed over the slip, the pharmacist typed my name into the glowing screen, and as she read the price aloud, a sum not small but not catastrophic either, he gave a sharp theatrical sigh, the kind of sound designed for an audience, and this time he did not even lower his voice or attempt to shield me. He simply said, "She doesn't have it. I'll cover it. Just ring me up." And the way he said it turned my existence into a transaction, as though my health was a charity project he had volunteered, for something that elevated him in the eyes of the young cashier, who now looked at me with a mixture of pity and impatience, as if to ask why I could not simply disappear so that the clean efficiency of her day could continue without the complication of my need. I wanted to speak, to correct him, to reach into my bag and pull out the neatly folded bills I had prepared for exactly this purpose. But in that moment, the muscles of my throat closed around my voice, and what emerged instead was a silence heavier than any word I could have chosen. The cashier took his card, swiped it, handed back the receipt with a perfunctory smile that belonged more to the screen behind her than to us, and my grandson pocketed the slip like a medal, turning to me with a grin that carried no warmth, only self-satisfaction, and he said, "All taken care of, Grandma. Don't worry about it." As though I should thank him for erasing me. That was the moment when the betrayal became undeniable. Not just a careless remark, not just a generational misunderstanding, but an act that rewrote the story of who I was, in the eyes of others, because standing in that pharmacy line, I was no longer the woman who had once balanced budgets with care, who had held a family together through years when the paychecks barely stretched to the end of the month, who had gone without new shoes so her children could have proper notebooks, who had hidden small luxuries for birthdays, inside flour tins where no one would find them. No, in that line I was simply a dependent, a figure of pity, someone incapable, and the cruelest part was that the author of this new story was my own grandson, the Afars child whose first steps I had clapped for, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose drawings I once pinned to the refrigerator as if they were masterpieces destined for museums. When we walked out onto the sidewalk, the cold air pressing against my cheeks, I tried again to say something, anything, but he was already talking into his phone, laughing with someone else, his free hand gesturing in the air, dismissing me not with words but with absence, as though I had become invisible the moment we left the counter. I trailed behind him, each step a negotiation with the pavement, each breath heavy with the realization that something irreversible had shifted, and by the time we reached the bus stop, I knew with clarity that what had happened inside that pharmacy was not a small embarrassment, not even an isolated cruelty, but the beginning of a new pattern, one that would spread quietly, insidiously, into the spaces of our family life, reshaping how I was seen, how I was spoken about, how I was allowed to exist. That evening, at dinner in my daughter's house where the table gleamed with polished wood and plates set like a photograph in a magazine, I heard it again. Not from him this time, but from her, my daughter-in-law, who smiled too sweetly and said, "We're just so grateful he looks after you, Mom, making sure you get everything you need." And though the words were dressed as kindness, I felt the sting beneath them, the implication that I had become someone to be looked after, monitored, accounted for, like a fragile piece of furniture that might break if left unattended. My grandson smirked at the remark, basking in the recognition, and I realized he had already told them, already constructed a version of me that required his guardianship, a version where I was no longer the matriarch but the dependent, the weight to be carried, the story to be told at gatherings with a sigh and a shake of the head. I ate my food slowly, the taste dulled by the bitterness rising in my chest, and I kept my eyes on the plate because if I looked up, I might have seen the triumph in his face, or worse, the indifference, and I could not bear either. Instead, I remembered the envelope hidden in my drawer at home, the one my husband had given me with quiet insistence all those years ago, the one that contained the card so heavy, so dark, that I had always treated it like something dangerous, something reserved for the kind of catastrophe you do not speak of until it arrives. He had pressed it into my hand and said, "Promise me you'll never let yourself be small. Promise me you'll remember you have this." And at the time I had laughed, telling him I was already small, that I had been small all my life. But he shook his head and said, "No, you are the one who holds us together, and if the day comes when they forget that, use this." That memory burned inside me now, as I sat at the table with the people who were supposed to be my family, who spoke around me as if I were a side note, as if my years of labor and sacrifice had evaporated the moment my grandson slid his card across a pharmacy counter. That was the catalyst. The spark that set alight the quiet anger I had carried for years but never given voice to, the moment I understood that if I did nothing, if I allowed this new story to settle, I would be erased entirely, remembered only as the woman who could not pay. And I knew, with a clarity as sharp as the edge of a knife, that I could not, would not, let that be the final version of me they carried forward. After that night, things did not explode in any sudden way. There was no confrontation with raised voices or slammed doors, nothing that could be pointed to as a scene. But instead there was a slow seeping, like water under floorboards, silent at first, invisible, until the wood begins to warp and groan, until you realize that the damage has already become part of the structure. My grandson, emboldened by his small performances of control, began to position himself as my caretaker in ways that were both subtle and relentless, and each gesture carried the weight of dismissal, even when dressed in the costume of concern. When we went to the grocery store together, because he insisted it was easier for him to drive me than for me to walk or take the bus, he would reach for my list and skim it quickly with a frown, crossing off items without even asking, saying, "You don't need this, Grandma. It's too expensive." Or, "This isn't good for you. Let's not." And each stroke of his pen erased not just a purchase, but a piece of my autonomy, as though I were no longer capable of knowing what I wanted to eat, what I preferred to cook, what small comforts I allowed myself after decades of putting others first. One afternoon, I placed a small bouquet of daisies in the cart. Nothing extravagant, just a cluster of bright yellow and white blooms that reminded me of my own mother's garden. And he plucked them out and set them back in the display with a laugh, saying, "Flowers die too quickly, waste of money, not seeing, or perhaps not caring, that for me they were not waste but memory, not expense but solace." I stood silent, ashamed of how easily I let him dictate what I could carry home, ashamed of how I watched the daisies remain behind under the harsh supermarket light, ashamed of how a woman who had once stretched pennies into meals had now been convinced to forfeit her right to a few fragile petals. At home, the pattern deepened. He began checking the receipts I laid on the counter, scanning them as though searching for evidence of irresponsibility, and each time he would sigh or shake his head, not loudly but loud enough for me to hear, an orchestra of judgment that needed no words. When I made tea, he would glance at the sugar bowl and say, "You really shouldn't, Grandma. It's not good for your blood pressure," forgetting or ignoring that I have measured spoons for decades, that I know my own limits better than he ever will. When I placed a tin of biscuits on the shelf, he muttered, "Empty calories," as though pleasure itself had become a crime. None of these comments were shouted, none cruel in their surface, but together they formed a chorus of diminishment, a constant reminder that in his eyes I was no longer a woman capable of choice, but a fragile figure needing management. The cruelty was in the casualness. He did not seem to realize, or perhaps he did and found it convenient, that with each correction, each sigh, each confiscated item, he was rewriting my identity not only for himself but for the family who listened to his stories. I overheard him once in the living room, speaking to his mother on the phone, telling her with a tone of pride, "Don't worry, Mom. I'm making sure. Grandma doesn't overspend. I keep an eye on her at the store. She'd buy silly things otherwise." And I felt my breath catch because the word silly fell heavier than stone, reducing me to a caricature, erasing years of steady accounting, of calculated decisions made under pressure, of bills always paid on time. Now I was simply silly, a silly old woman who could not be trusted to manage a cart of groceries or a handful of change. The walls of my apartment seemed to absorb the shift, growing closer around me. I noticed how, when I reached for my purse, my hands hesitated, as though expecting inspection, as though my money no longer belonged entirely to me. I noticed how I folded receipts carefully and placed them in a drawer, not because I wanted to track my spending, but because I feared the questions if I did not have them ready. My independence was being trimmed in small increments, so quiet that no one could accuse him of cruelty. But I felt it in my bones the way winter creeps in through cracks in old windows, subtle, persistent, unavoidable. It was in the silences, too. When we walked together, he no longer asked about my past, about the stories he once begged to hear of his grandfather, or of the years when we lived in the small house by the river. Instead, he spoke of his own life, his friends, his frustrations, occasionally pausing to offer me advice I had not requested. "You should think about moving in with us eventually, Grandma," he said one evening as we carried groceries up the stairs. "It would be easier for everyone. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or shopping, and we'd keep an eye on you." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because the fight had drained from me in that moment. And I thought about how invisibility often begins with acquiescence, with the small nods that keep the peace but carve away at the self. What unsettled me most was not his words, but how easily I began to accept them, how quickly I adjusted to his oversight, how I caught myself before buying something unnecessary, not out of frugality, but out of fear of his disapproval. I remembered the daisies, how quickly I had let them go, how I had walked away without insisting, and I knew that the erosion of dignity rarely comes in a single blow, but in the quiet surrender of moments. And so the escalation was not dramatic but suffocating, not a fire but a slow smothering, and it frightened me more than rage ever could, because it suggested that if I did nothing, if I remained silent, I would one day wake to find myself erased, entirely, remembered not as a woman but as a burden. And the tragedy of it was that the one leading me there was the boy whose tiny hand had once clung to mine as though I were the only solid thing in his world. It was on a gray afternoon, the kind of day when the sky seems to press down on the rooftops and the air carries a heaviness that makes even the birds hesitate to fly, that I opened the drawer where I had kept the envelope all these years, the one my husband had given me with such solemn insistence, and though I had touched it many times before, smoothing the edges, adjusting the pile of scarves that lay above it, I had never dared to slide the card out and look at it directly, as if doing so would admit defeat, as if acknowledging its existence meant I had finally reached the point of catastrophe he had once warned me about. Yet that afternoon, after weeks of watching my grandson erase me with sighs and glances, after nights of lying awake with the weight of his words pressing against my chest, I decided that silence was a greater catastrophe than any financial storm. And so I drew out the envelope with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from recognition, and I slid it open carefully, pulling out the card that gleamed darker than memory, heavier than logic, its surface cool beneath my fingertips like polished stone. I sat with it in my lap for a long while, listening to the kettle whistle in the kitchen, hearing the faint hum of traffic outside. And I remembered the day he had pressed it into my hand, my husband, with that look he always wore when he wanted me to take something seriously, a look that mixed tenderness with steel. "For emergencies," he had said, his voice low, "not the kind you can fix with a neighbor's kindness or a borrowed $1, but the kind that tests who you are. Promise me you'll keep it." I had laughed then, telling him I didn't want to live as if waiting for disaster, but he only shook his head and said, "It's not about disaster, it's about dignity." At the time I had not understood the difference. Now I did. Dignity was not about what you had, but about refusing to let others decide what you lacked. Holding that card, I felt something shift inside me, a small pivot, like a wheel beginning to turn after years of stillness. I realized that all this time I had been shrinking, folding myself into smaller and smaller spaces to avoid conflict, nodding at decisions that were not mine, accepting erasures as though they were inevitable. But in truth, I had been carrying the means to remind myself of who I was all along. It wasn't about the money. though the card promised access to more than I could spend in my lifetime. It was about the symbol, the weight of my husband's faith in me, the tangible reminder that I had earned, through years of sacrifice and work, the TC, right to stand without apology. That night I placed the card on the table beside my cup of tea and stared at it as if it were a mirror. I thought about the years I had lived quietly, about the long days when I cooked meals from scraps, and the longer nights when I balanced the checkbook by lamplight, always ensuring that the family never knew the full extent of the tightrope I walked. I had been invisible even then, but I had been strong, and somewhere along the way I had let them convince me that invisibility was weakness instead of strength. The card reminded me otherwise. I could almost hear my husband's laugh, that deep, knowing chuckle, as if he were saying, "Well, sweetheart, it's about time." The next morning, I dressed with care, not for anyone else, but for myself. I pulled out the navy dress I hadn't worn in years, the one that still held the faint scent of lavender from the sachet I kept in the drawer, and I buttoned it slowly, savoring the way the fabric settled against me, reminding me of the woman I had been when I first wore it to a dinner decades ago. I slipped the card into my wallet, not hidden in an envelope anymore, but resting firmly in the place where it belonged, beside my ID, beside the cash I carried, beside the coins that clinked softly when I closed the clasp. I felt taller walking out the door, though my steps were as measured as ever, and the air seemed less heavy, the sky less oppressive, as though simply carrying the card had shifted the balance between myself and the world. For the first time in weeks, I bought something unnecessary on purpose. I stepped into the corner bakery where the scent of sugar and yeast filled the air like an embrace, and I ordered a slice of cake, lemon with cream, the kind I had always loved but rarely indulged in. I handed over a few bills, not the card, not yet. But when the cashier returned the change, she looked at me as if I were simply a customer. Nothing more, nothing less. And I realized how long it had been since I felt that kind of neutrality. That absence of pity or patronization. I carried the cake home in a little white box, placed it on the table, cut myself a generous slice, and ate it slowly, savoring each bite as though I were reclaiming not just a flavor, but a right. And in a way, I was. That evening, when my grandson arrived unannounced, as he often did, poking his head into the kitchen and scanning the counter for signs of what I had purchased, I did not rush to hide the box. I let it sit there in plain sight, the bright white cardboard glowing against the wood, and when he asked, "What's that, Grandma? You bought cake?" I met his gaze steadily and said, "Yes, I did." For myself, he frowned, muttered something about sugar and health, but I did not reply. Instead, I lifted my fork and took another bite while he stood there watching, and for once, it was he who fell silent. That was the shift, small and quiet, but unmistakable. The realization that I did not need to fight with shouting or grand gestures, that I could resist by simply choosing, by refusing to apologize for the space I occupied, for the money I spent, for the pleasures I allowed myself. And though he did not know it, the black card in my wallet pulsed with possibility, a silent ally waiting for the moment when I would need it, reminding me that the story he had begun to tell about me was not the final word. It is a strange thing to realize that a story about you is being told without your participation, that people you once trusted are carrying a version of your life into rooms where you are not present, repeating it until it hardens into truth, and that by the time it returns to you, it has already gathered weight and shape like snow rolling down a hill. That was what began to happen after the cake, after I allowed myself that small victory. Because victories do not go unnoticed. They disturb the balance of control, and those who benefit from your silence will always feel threatened by the sound of your own voice returning. My grandson must have spoken to his mother, because soon she began dropping comments that dripped with concern, the kind of remarks that sound like kindness on the surface but carry judgment underneath, like a spoonful of sugar with something bitter hidden at the bottom. When I visited her house for Sunday dinner, she leaned across the table with that practiced smile and said, "We're all just so glad he's watching out. For you, Mom, you know it's important at your age to have someone manage the details." And though her words were smooth, the message was sharp, that I was no longer trusted with my own life. Around the table, the children, her children, my grandchildren, nodded as though this were obvious, as though the woman who had once babysat them, cooked for them, bought them birthday gifts when their parents forgot, was suddenly incapable of remembering to pay a bill or make a decision. I chewed my food slowly, tasting nothing, because I knew that if I spoke, then my words would only confirm the caricature, the silly old grandmother who gets defensive when told she needs help. It did not stop at the dinner table. At a neighbor's gathering, where I was invited out of politeness rather than genuine interest, I overheard one of them whispering to another, "Oh, she's lucky her grandson keeps an eye on her. Otherwise, who knows what trouble she'd get into." And, though they smiled when I entered the room, the words clung to me like smoke, proof that the story had already traveled further than I imagined. I thought of the daisies in the supermarket, how easily they had been plucked from my hands, and realized that my dignity was now being plucked in the same casual manner, replaced with a narrative more convenient for those who preferred to see me. Small. The escalation was subtle but relentless. My phone began to ring more often, my daughter's voice on the other end asking not how I was, but whether I had remembered to take my medicine, whether I had enough money for groceries, whether the heating bill was too much for me to manage. At first I answered politely, assuring her I was fine, that I had lived alone for years and knew how to balance a checkbook, but she responded with the kind of silence that tells you your words are not believed, that the script has already been written, and you are merely improvising in a play whose ending has been decided. I began to dread the calls, not because they were frequent, but because each one chipped away at the person I knew myself to be, until even I started to wonder whether perhaps they saw something I did not, whether perhaps I had become the fragile figure they described. The final blow came one evening at a larger family gathering, a birthday celebration for my great-granddaughter, where the house was full of balloons and chatter, and I sat quietly in the corner, content to watch the children play, when my grandson, emboldened by his audience, raised his voice in jest and said, "Grandma never pays for anything these days. I take care of it all." And the room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that smooths over discomfort without addressing it. My cheeks burned, my hands trembled slightly on the cup of tea I held, and I felt the eyes of everyone in the room slide over me with a mixture of amusement and pity, as though I had been reduced to a character in a family comedy, the dependent matriarch who could not manage her own affairs. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub, staring at the tiles while the sound of laughter continued outside. I thought of the black card in my wallet, the one that had become both comfort and promise, and I felt its weight even through the leather, pressing against my side like a reminder. I took it out and held it in my hands, tracing the embossed letters with my thumb, and I whispered aloud, though no one could hear me, "They will not erase me. Not yet." In that moment, I understood that the card was not merely a tool, but a weapon, not against them directly, but against the story they were trying to impose on me. When I returned to the living room, I was calm, my face composed, and I sat back in my chair as though nothing had happened. But inside something had shifted. A decision had begun to crystallize. I could no longer wait for them to remember who I was, because they had chosen to forget. I could no longer hope they would see me as I once had been, because they preferred the easier image of dependency. If I wanted to reclaim myself, I would have to show them, not with words, because words could be dismissed, but with action, something undeniable, something public, something that could not be rewritten in their favor. In the days that followed, the pressure increased. My daughter suggested gently, almost casually, that I consider moving into an assisted living facility, just so you don't have to worry about all the little things. My grandson began showing me brochures for senior apartments, slipping them onto the table with a smile that did not reach his eyes, saying, "It would be safer, Grandma. You wouldn't have to manage on your own." Each suggestion was framed as care, as protection, but beneath the gloss of kindness lay the truth. They wanted control. They wanted to manage not only my money but my existence, to fold me neatly into a space where I could be monitored and contained. I resisted with silence at first, folding the brochures and placing them in a drawer, letting their words drift past me without response. But silence is its own kind of consent, and I knew they would interpret it as weakness. So one morning, after another phone call full of questions about my bills and whether I had enough to last the month, I opened my wallet, slid the black card into the slot where it gleamed like a secret, and told myself that the next time they tried to perform my dependence in public, I would end it, not with anger, but with proof. The moment came sooner than I expected. Back at the pharmacy, standing again under those humming lights, the cashier calling out the price of my prescription, my grandson sighing dramatically, reaching for his card as though stepping into a role he had rehearsed, ready once more to cast me as the helpless grandmother. But this time I was ready. I placed my hand over his, firm but not harsh, and I said in a clear voice, "No, I'll pay." He laughed lightly, trying to turn it into a joke, saying, "Grandma, don't be silly." But I had already drawn out the black card, laying it on the counter with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I watched the cashier's eyes widen slightly as she picked it up, swiped it, and handed me the receipt. The machine beeped its confirmation. The slip of paper slid across the counter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground solid beneath me. My grandson stared, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. The silence that followed was not mine this time. It was his, heavy and awkward, thick with the realization that his story had been broken, that the version of me he had offered the world could no longer stand unchallenged. I folded the receipt carefully, placed it in my wallet, and picked up the small white bag of medicine. Then, without looking at him, I said, "Shall we go?" My voice was calm, almost casual, but inside I was trembling. Not from fear, but from release, as if I had just cut through a rope that had been binding me for too long. As we stepped outside into the air, I felt taller, the sky seemed brighter, and the weight of weeks of humiliation began to lift. I knew the battle was not over, that there would be more whispers, more attempts to diminish me, but something irreversible had happened at that counter. The story had changed, and I had written the new line myself. I woke before the sun. The room still blue with that thin hour when the city holds its breath, and I made coffee the way I always do, measuring the grounds with the same spoon I used when my husband was alive, and while the kettle hissed, I took the black card from my wallet and set it on the table beside the folded list I had written in careful handwriting the night before. Not a list of groceries or errands, but of decisions, each one small on paper and enormous in consequence. And I told myself that the only way to end a story someone else is telling about you is to write a new chapter in ink that will not wash off. I dressed slowly, buttoned the navy dress that makes me feel less like a shadow, put on my coat even though the day promised warmth, and walked out into the pale morning with my bag heavy, not from what it carried, but from the certainty that by evening, my life would no longer fit where it had been placed. At the bank, I asked for the branch manager, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because precision matters when you are closing doors. And the woman who met me, Ms. Patel, brisk, kind, eyes like someone who has seen too many avoidable tragedies, sat me down in a small glass room and asked how she could help, and I said, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, that I wished to separate accounts, to remove any view-only permissions that my grandson had persuaded me to accept under the friendly banner of keeping an eye on things, to disable transfers except by my own signature, to set alerts and statements to my address only, to put a note in, bright letters that no one was to discuss or access my finances, and while she typed, her nails clicking a soft staccato, I filled out forms and signed them one after the other, and with each signature, I could feel the story loosening its grip, the narrative thread, slipping from the hands that had held it so easily. She asked if I had anyone I wanted listed as a durable power should I need it someday, and I told her I would appoint a professional, not family, and she nodded like a woman who understands that love is not the same as stewardship, then called in the notary, who stamped the papers with a firm sound that felt like a gate closing behind me, and I breathed in a little deeper, as if there were suddenly more air in the room. From the bank I walked to my doctor's office, that familiar corridor with its soft carpet and posters about heart health, and I waited like everyone else, not special, not invisible, simply present. And when it was my turn, I met the administrators, eyes, and said that I needed my HIPAA preferences updated to list only me as the point of contact. No disclosures to family without my explicit written permission. No messages left with anyone but me. And I watched as she entered the request and printed a confirmation that I folded into my bag like a flag I could raise if challenged. Then I set the same boundary at the pharmacy, where the pharmacist I have known for years leaned forward over the counter to hear my quiet voice and nodded. Gravely when I asked that no one pick up or pay for my medication without a written authorization. No casual kindnesses that become leashes. No performances of care that come at the price of my autonomy. And she tapped the changes into my file, and when she finished, she said, "If anyone gives you trouble, send them to me." And that simple sentence, offered without pity, felt like a hand on my back steadying me over a threshold. On my way out, I stopped at the copy shop and made neat duplicates of everything, because paper can be a shield and a map, and I put each set into envelopes labeled in my neat script, so that if my resolve ever faltered, I could still follow a trail I had laid for myself when I was brave. Only then did I call him. I did not ask him to come. I told him to meet me, and my voice carried the tone of the woman who once taught him to tie his shoes, who once set a limit and kept it. And perhaps he heard that because he arrived on time for once, striding into the pharmacy with the confidence of a man stepping onto a stage he believes he owns, offering a smile to the cashier he now considered part of his audience. And I felt the familiar tremor of dread try to rise, but I pressed it down with the flat of my palm against my bag where the black card lay cool and certain, and I moved forward. The prescription was ready, the price spoken aloud, his sigh already forming like a cloud in his chest, and before he could play his line, I placed the card on the counter and said, "I'll handle it." Not loudly, not defiantly, simply as a fact. Reclaimed, and the cashier took it without drama, swiped it, and handed me the pen to sign while my grandson blinked like someone whose glasses had been switched without warning. He reached for his wallet anyway, a reflex, an old habit, and I did not look at him. I thanked the pharmacist by name, tucked the receipt into my wallet, and took the small white bag that once felt like contraband, but now felt like proof, and I stepped away from the counter into the narrow aisle where the inexpensive reading glasses hang, and there I turned to him and gave him the envelope I had prepared, which contained a simple letter written in my careful hand, a copy of the bank. Directives, the medical privacy changes, and a single polished sentence at the end. You will not act for me. You will not speak for me. You will not perform me. He laughed then, a small brittle sound, and said I was overreacting, that he was only trying to help, that I was making things difficult, that people would talk, that family is supposed to share burdens, and for a heartbeat I saw the child he had been, the boy who wanted to be praised, who could not understand why the trick he had, mastered, no longer earned him applause, and I felt the soft ache of love for him, the memory of his small hand in mine. But love is not license, and memory is not consent. And I told him so in words that were not angry but immovable. I said that we would not be going to the grocery store together for a while, that he would not be handling my prescriptions, that if he wished to visit, he could do so without inspecting the contents of my cupboards, that the key he held to my apartment had served its purpose and was now to be returned, and I held out my hand and waited until he placed it in my palm, hot with the heat of his embarrassment, and I closed my fingers around it the way a woman closes her hand around her own name after someone has tried to steal it. He began to argue again, then stopped, the words tangling in his mouth because there was nothing to push against. I had removed the theater, I had turned off the lights, I had reclaimed the stage by refusing to stand on it, and at last he looked away, and said he would call me tomorrow, and I told him a call would be welcome as long as it came without instructions, and that I loved him, and that love would not be the blade by which I was cut. When I stepped back into the street with the medicine in my bag, the air felt different, not warmer or cooler, not lighter or heavier, but personal, as if the city had shifted a quarter turn to regard me directly, and the ground under my shoes did not wobble the way it had in the weeks of quiet erosion, and I walked not home at first, but to a small store I have always liked, the one that sells practical things in muted colors. And I bought a wallet with a clean clasp and a sturdy lining, not fancy but well made. And on the sidewalk outside I emptied the old one, smoothing the receipts and the small notes I keep for myself. And I slid the black card into its new place with a deliberate care that felt ceremonial, the way you place a photograph on a mantle, or a book back on the shelf it belongs to. Then I dropped the old wallet into the shop's donation basket and felt no tug of superstition, only a quiet sense of order restored. Back at my apartment, I boiled water again and set the spare key on a plate in the center of the table, a small metal moon, and I wrote one more letter, this time addressed to myself, because some declarations must be witnessed by the person they concern, and I wrote that I had done what I came to the day to do, that the boundaries were not punishments but protections, that I would not apologize for living inside my own life, and I signed it with my full name, the one that has traveled, through offices and kitchens and bus stops and cashier lines and hospital corridors, and still arrives intact when I speak it aloud. That evening he called, as he promised, and for the first time in weeks, his voice sounded unsure, thinner, as if he were carefully testing the floorboards of a house he thought he knew, and he asked if I was angry, and I told him I was not angry. Anymore, that anger had been the match, not the fire, that what burned now was only the fog he had created, and that it was clearing because I had thrown open the windows, and I told him that we could begin again if he wished, but on new terms, mine, and that if he spoke of me in rooms where I was not present, he should say this: she pays, she decides, she is not a project, she is a person. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he did not know how to be around me if he was not rescuing me, and I told him that was something he would have to learn for himself. The way you learn to ride a bicycle without training wheels, trembling, at first, then steady, and as we hung up I felt neither victory nor defeat, but a calm certainty that cannot be undone by anyone else's confusion. Before bed I opened the window a little and let the night in, the city breathing its mixed breath of buses and distant frying onions, and the faint sweetness of someone's laundry, and I took the small white pharmacy bag from my purse and set it next to the card, not as trophies but as tools, not as proof for others but as reminders for me, and I said my husband's name into the room because sometimes you have to hear yourself speak to know you are still here, and I told him that I had used it, that I had done it in daylight with my back straight and my voice steady, and I felt, absurdly and completely, that he was pleased. Then I turned off the light and lay down, and for the first time in a long while sleep came without negotiation, because tomorrow would not require me to shrink to fit anyone's story, and that is an ending that is also a beginning, and it cannot be taken back. The morning after Kieran left, the house was hushed in that way old houses are when they seem to hold their breath, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling slowly between my palms, the steam rising and fading like the remnants of a storm that had finally passed. I looked around at the modest walls, the worn floorboards, the chipped mug Joyce always insisted was lucky, and I realized that for the first time in years, perhaps decades, I was not bracing myself for the next dismissal, the next instruction, the next reminder that I was tolerated rather than wanted. Instead, I felt the peculiar weightlessness that comes when you stop fighting for a seat at someone else's table and begin setting your own. I thought of the pharmacy counter, the white paper bag, the black card pressed firmly in my hand, and how that small gesture had rippled outward until it became not just a payment, but a declaration. The line that divided silence from speech, erasure from existence. Kieran's visit had sealed it. His quiet eyes, the way he listened without pressing, the simple truth of his presence. It had shown me that love can survive without control, that connection is not the same as surveillance, that being remembered for who you are is more valuable than being paraded as what others wish to display. He carried pieces of me forward, not as obligations or burdens, but as memories he had chosen to keep, and in his voice I heard not pity but recognition. It was enough, more than enough, to remind me that I had not been erased completely, that the threads of my life still ran forward into hands willing to hold them gently. In the evenings now, I sit on the porch with Joyce, each of us wrapped in quilts that smell faintly of lavender and detergent, sipping tea or sometimes the boxed wine she favors, and we watch the street grow quiet under the soft haze of the streetlights. Franklin the cat sprawls at our feet, twitching in his sleep, and we do not need to fill the air with chatter, because the silence feels earned, no longer imposed. Sometimes Arthur joins us, his cane propped carefully against the step, his stories wandering from birds to weather to half-remembered jokes, and I let the rhythm of ordinary companionship wrap around me like a second blanket. It is not the family I once thought would cradle me in old age, but it is family all the same, chosen in small acts of trust and tolerance, built from the simple agreement not to diminish one another. I no longer wait by the phone, no longer measure my worth in the tone of voices that never truly wanted to hear me. The calls come still. Sometimes, Adam's clipped messages, Lisa's rehearsed concern, but I do not answer. I do not owe them explanations for a freedom they never intended to allow me. I answer only Kieran, sometimes with a call, sometimes with a letter, and in those exchanges, I feel the possibility of a future that is not tainted by old wounds. The rest I let drift into silence, where they belong. At the cafe, I move with more ease now, my hands remembering the rhythm of work, my body finding comfort in routine, and when the regulars nod to me with recognition, when Arthur lifts his mug in quiet salute, when Heather hands me the crossword page, with a muttered, "Figured you'd want this?" I feel myself stitched back into a fabric I once thought had torn beyond repair. It is not glamorous, not grand, but it is steady. And in steadiness, I have found something better than forgiveness. I have found peace. One evening, after my shift, I walked home in my navy coat, the air sharp with the promise of rain, and I paused under a streetlight looking up at the sky. I thought of Derek, of the day he pressed the envelope into my hand and told me it was not about disaster, but about dignity, and I whispered into the night, "I understand now." The black card rests still in my wallet, but it is no longer a weapon, no longer a shield. It is simply a reminder that I carry the right to decide, to choose, to live without apology. So this is my life now, not the one they curated for me, not the one they diminished me into, but the one I built when I walked away from the counter, when I refused to wait in the lounge, when I finally chose myself. And if you, whoever you are, find yourself listening to this, waiting in some room where you have been placed, told to sit quietly until someone comes back for you, I want you to know, you are not luggage. You are not an afterthought. You are not invisible unless you agree to be. Stand, take your bag, walk to the counter, ask for a ticket, or pull out whatever card or coin or memory of strength you still carry, and choose your own destination. It will not be easy, it will not erase the ache, but it will be yours, and that is enough. I am 77 years old, and I have finally stopped waiting for permission to live. That is my resolution. That is my peace. And if you are hearing me, may it be yours too.